The evening air carried that crisp October bite, just enough to make you pull your jacket a little tighter but not enough to send you rushing indoors. Street lights flickered on one by one as dusk settled over the quiet neighborhood, casting long shadows across driveways and sidewalks. In a modest sedan with slightly worn tires and a bumper sticker that read, "Be kind," Evelyn Carter turned onto Maple Ridge Lane, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She wasn't in a hurry. There was no one waiting for her at home, not anymore. Her husband had passed 6 months ago after a long, quiet battle with illness, and since then, the house had grown quieter too, filled more with memories than voices. She'd just wrapped up a late session at the courthouse, reviewing case files for an upcoming hearing. It wasn't required, she could have done it at home, but sometimes staying late helped. The empty corridors, the hum of fluorescent lights, the weight of legal texts on shelves, it all felt steadier than the silence of her living room. Tonight she wore faded jeans, a soft gray sweater, and her hair pulled back in a loose bun. No robe, no gavel, no title visible. Just a woman driving home after a long day, eyes tired but alert, mind still turning over motions and objections like stones in a river. She slowed as she approached the intersection near Oak Hollow Park. A patrol car sat idling on the side of the road, its lights off but engine running. She didn't think much of it. Officers often parked there during shift changes. But then, without warning, red and blue lights flashed behind her. Her stomach dropped. She signaled and pulled over smoothly onto the shoulder, heart already beginning to thud in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. 2 officers stepped out. One was tall, broad-shouldered with a stiff gait. The other was younger, wiry, scanning her car like it might sprout weapons at any second. They approached slowly, flashlights cutting through the dimness. Evelyn rolled down her window halfway, keeping her hands visible on the wheel. "Evening," she said calmly. The older officer leaned in, his face unreadable under the brim of his cap. "License and registration." She nodded, reached for her glove compartment, slowly, deliberately, and retrieved both. "Is everything all right, officer?" "Got a call about a suspicious vehicle circling the block," he said, barely glancing at her documents. "You live around here?" "Yes," she replied. 3 blocks down on Sycamore." He grunted, then turned to his partner. "Runner." The younger one took the license and walked back to the cruiser. Evelyn stayed still, breathing evenly. She'd been stopped before, once in law school, once early in her judicial career, but never like this. There was a tension in the air, a stiffness in the way the older officer stood, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She knew that look. It wasn't suspicion. It was assumption. Minutes passed. Crickets chirped. A distant dog barked. The cruiser's radio crackled with static. Then the younger officer returned, frowning. "Says she's clean," he muttered, "but the address doesn't match the name in the system." Evelyn blinked. "That's odd. I've lived at that address for 18 years. The older officer finally looked at her, really looked. Not at her eyes, but at her face, her skin, her hair. His voice dropped low enough that only she could hear. "You sure you didn't borrow this car? Or maybe pick it up somewhere?" The words landed like a slap. She didn't flinch, but inside something tightened. A familiar coil of anger and exhaustion she'd spent a lifetime learning to control. "I own this car," she said evenly. "I'm a judge at the county courthouse. My husband passed earlier this year. I've been handling his estate, which is why my name might not pop up the way you expect." The officer's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "Step out of the vehicle, please. Am I under arrest?" she asked. "No," he said. "But we need to verify your identity." She hesitated. She knew her rights. But she also knew how these things could spiral, how calm could be mistaken for defiance, how asking for a lawyer could be seen as guilt. And so slowly she opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, keeping her movements deliberate, non-threatening. The night air felt colder now. "Hands where I can see them," the younger officer said, though she hadn't moved toward her pockets or waistband. She raised them slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Just routine," the older one said, but his tone said otherwise. He patted her down. Brisk, impersonal, but lingering just long enough to feel like a message. Then he walked back to the cruiser again, this time speaking into his radio with more urgency. Evelyn stood by her car, arms loose at her sides now, watching headlights pass on the distant road. Each one felt like a missed chance, someone who might have seen, someone who might have cared. 10 more minutes crawled by. She asked again if she was being detained. The answer was vague. We're just clearing things up. She asked to call someone. Not necessary, they said. She asked for their badge numbers. The younger one mumbled them. The older one didn't respond at all. Then, finally, a third vehicle pulled up, a black SUV with a gold stripe. A sergeant stepped out, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, calm demeanor. He took one look at Evelyn, then at the officers, and his face changed. "Judge Carter?" he said, voice softening instantly. She nodded. He turned sharply to the two officers. "You detained a sitting judge without cause and didn't verify her identity properly?" The older officer opened his mouth, but the sergeant cut him off. "Get her license back in her hand, now, and apologize." The younger one handed over the documents, eyes downcast. The older one muttered something that might have been sorry, but it was so low it vanished into the night. The sergeant turned to Evelyn. "I am deeply sorry, Your Honor. This should never have happened." She took a slow breath. The anger was still there, coiled deep, but she pushed it down. Not because she wanted to be polite, but because she knew what came next mattered more than how she felt in this moment. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'd like to go home now," he nodded. "Of course, and I'll be filing a full report by morning." She got back in her car, hands steady now, though her pulse still hummed in her ears. As she drove away, she didn't look in the rearview mirror. She didn't need to. She could feel their stares, their confusion, their dawning realization that they'd misjudged not just a person, but power, dignity, and the quiet strength that doesn't wear a uniform. Back home, she parked in the driveway, sat for a long moment with the engine off, listening to the silence. The house was dark. No one would ask how her day went. No one would make her tea or rub her shoulders. But that didn't mean she was alone in what she'd just endured. She thought of all the people, especially black women, who'd stood on roadsides like that, hearts pounding, voices calm, hoping to make it home in one piece. She thought of her husband, who'd always told her, "Your composure is your armor." She walked inside, turned on a single lamp in the living room, and sat on the couch. Not to cry, not to rage, but to remember this wasn't just about her. It was about every time someone assumed the worst because of how you look, where you live, or what you drive, and it was about what happens next, because she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this wasn't over. The officers thought they'd just detained a woman. They didn't know they'd just stepped into a courtroom they couldn't leave. The courthouse buzzed with its usual mid-morning energy, clacking heels on marble floors, the low murmur of attorneys huddled in corners, the occasional gavel tap echoing from distant chambers. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in the air like tiny stars drifting through legal gravity. Courtroom 4B was scheduled for a disciplinary hearing, the kind that rarely drew crowds but always carried weight behind closed doors. Two officers stood near the back wall, shifting their weight from foot to foot, uniforms crisp but faces tight. They'd been told this was routine, just paperwork, a formality after a complaint that never should have gained traction. Internal Affairs had assured them it would be handled quietly, internally with minimal fuss. They hadn't been told who would be presiding. The older officer kept glancing at his watch, jaw clenched. He'd barely slept since that night on Maple Ridge Lane. Not because he felt guilty, no. He told himself he'd followed protocol. But because something about the way that woman had looked at him, calm and unshaken even as he patted her down, had stuck in his mind like a splinter. He'd replayed the encounter a dozen times, trying to convince himself he'd done nothing wrong. After all, she hadn't shown ID right away. The address didn't match. It was dark. He'd been cautious. That's what they trained you to be. His partner, the younger one, was quieter. He kept his eyes on the floor, hands tucked into his pockets. He remembered the way her voice hadn't risen, even when the older officer made that comment under his breath, the one he hoped no one heard. He remembered how she'd asked for their badge numbers like it was nothing, like she'd done it 100 times before. And he remembered the moment the sergeant showed up, the color draining from his face when he said Judge Carter. That name had hit him like a cold splash of water. He'd Googled her that night, read her bio, saw her photo in judicial robes, stern but fair-eyed, standing beside the mayor at a community event. He'd felt sick for hours. Now, standing in the hallway outside courtroom 4B, neither of them spoke. They just waited, trying to project confidence they didn't feel. Inside the courtroom, clerks arranged files, bailiffs checked seating, and a few reporters from the local paper lingered near the back, drawn not by scandal but by curiosity. Word had spread quietly through the legal grapevine. A sitting judge had filed a formal complaint against 2 patrol officers for unlawful detention and racial profiling. That alone was rare, but the fact that she'd requested to preside over the disciplinary hearing herself, that was unprecedented. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose, and then she walked in. Judge Evelyn Carter entered with the same quiet dignity she carried everywhere. No flourish, no glare, no dramatic pause. Her robe fell straight and clean over her shoulders, her hair neatly pinned back, her expression unreadable. She moved to the bench, placed her notes down with a soft thud, and sat. Only then did she look out at the room. Her eyes met the 2 officers. The older one froze. His breath caught. He'd seen her in street clothes, vulnerable under flashing lights, but this was different. Here, she wasn't just a woman they'd pulled over. She was the law itself, seated above them, holding the gavel, controlling the pace, the questions, the consequences. His stomach twisted. He glanced at his partner, who had gone pale. She gave no sign of recognition beyond a slight professional nod. No smirk, no narrowed eyes, just the neutral, composed presence of a judge doing her job. But everyone in the room could feel it. The air had changed. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning wearing a robe. "Be seated," she said, her voice calm, clear, and utterly steady. The proceedings began with dry formalities: case number, parties present, nature of the complaint. The department's attorney, a man with thinning hair and a practiced frown, stood to speak. He framed the incident as a miscommunication, emphasizing the officers' clean records and years of service. They were responding to a legitimate concern, he said, and acted in good faith based on the information available at the time. Evelyn listened without interruption. When he finished, she turned to the officers. "Do either of you wish to make an opening statement?" The younger one shook his head quickly. The older one cleared his throat. "We were just doing our jobs, Your Honor." She didn't react, just nodded slightly. Very well, then came the evidence phase. First, the body cam footage. The screen flickered to life, showing the stop from the older officer's perspective. There she was, Evelyn, rolling down her window, speaking politely, hands visible. The officers' voices filled the room, clipped, suspicious, increasingly impatient. At one point, the older officer muttered, "You always this calm when you're up to something?" The courtroom went still. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn didn't flinch. She just said, "Play it again from 314, they did." This time everyone heard it clearly. A low murmur rippled through the observers. Then came the civilian witness, an elderly woman who lived across from Oak Hollow Park. She'd been sitting on her porch that night, knitting, when she saw the whole thing unfold. That woman never raised her voice, she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. She stood there like she was waiting for a bus, not like she'd done anything wrong. And those officers, they treated her like she was dangerous, just because she was alone, just because she was black. The department's attorney tried to downplay it, one perspective, he called it, but Evelyn let the words hang in the air. She didn't need to argue. The truth was already speaking for itself. During a short recess, the 2 officers stepped into the hallway. The older one paced, muttering about overreaction and political pressure, but his partner leaned against the wall, arms crossed, staring at the floor. "We messed up," he said quietly. "What are you talking about?" The older one snapped. "We followed procedure, did we?" The younger one asked, finally looking up. "We didn't run her license right away. We didn't believe her when she said she lived nearby. We made assumptions. And you said that thing. You know you did." The older officer opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Back in the courtroom, Evelyn reviewed the officers' written reports. She pointed out discrepancies, times that didn't match the body cam, descriptions that exaggerated her behavior, omissions of her repeated requests to contact legal counsel. "You claim she was evasive," she said, reading from the report. "Yet the footage shows her answering every question directly. Can you explain that contradiction?" The older officer stammered. Maybe I misremembered in the moment." Under stress, his attorney added quickly. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Stress doesn't erase facts, counselor. It reveals character. The room fell silent again. As the morning wore on, it became clear this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every inconsistency, it all pointed in one direction. And at the center of it all sat a woman who had every reason to be furious but chose instead to be precise. To be fair. To let the process do its work even when it hurt. At one point, a young law clerk, a black woman in her early 20s, caught Evelyn's eye as she handed over a file. There was no smile, no nod, but something passed between them anyway. A silent understanding, the kind that doesn't need words. By lunchtime, the mood in the courthouse had shifted. Whispers followed the officers as they walked to the cafeteria. Even other officers avoided eye contact. They weren't heroes today. They were liabilities. Back in the courtroom after the break, Evelyn called the next witness, the sergeant who'd arrived that night. He testified plainly without embellishment. I recognized Judge Carter immediately, he said. I knew the stop was unjustified. I apologized on behalf of the department. Did you report the incident that night? Evelyn asked. Yes, ma'am. I filed a preliminary report before I left the scene. Was it acted upon? He hesitated. Not until your formal complaint was submitted. She nodded. That was all she needed. The rest of the afternoon was a slow unraveling. The department's attorney grew more defensive. The officers grew quieter. And Evelyn, she remained steady, asking questions that cut through excuses like a knife through fog. She wasn't performing. She wasn't grandstanding. She was simply holding up a mirror and forcing everyone in that room to look into it. When court adjourned for the day, she didn't make a speech. She just said, We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9. Officers, you're expected to be present. They nodded stiffly and left without looking back. Outside, the sky had turned gray, clouds rolling in from the west. Evelyn stayed in her chambers for a long time after everyone left. She took off her robe, folded it carefully over the back of her chair, and sat at her desk. On it sat a framed photo, her and her husband smiling on a beach in North Carolina years ago. He'd always said she was too patient, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes justice needs teeth, he'd told her once. She hadn't agreed then. But now, sitting in the quiet aftermath of a day that had laid bare so much, she wondered if he'd been right. Still, she wouldn't rush. She wouldn't punish out of anger, because real justice wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And today, the truth had started to speak. Tomorrow, it would finish. The courthouse felt heavier the next morning, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rain had fallen overnight, leaving the sidewalk slick and the air thick with the smell of wet pavement and damp leaves. Inside courtroom 4B, the same faces returned, the attorneys, the clerks, the reporters. But the mood had shifted. What had begun as a routine disciplinary hearing now carried the quiet tension of something much larger, something that couldn't be undone. People spoke in lower voices. Chairs scraped more softly. Even the usual rustle of papers seemed muted, as if everyone understood they were witnessing more than just a case. They were watching a moment unfold that might echo far beyond these walls. Evelyn arrived early before anyone else. She sat alone in her chambers, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug her husband had bought at a flea market years ago. The steam curled upward, vanishing into the stillness. She wasn't nervous, but she was aware, deeply, achingly aware of the weight resting on her shoulders. Not just as a judge, but as a woman who'd stood on that roadside, hands raised, dignity questioned, simply because of the color of her skin. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, but now that she was in it, she owed it to every person who'd ever been made to feel small by those sworn to protect them to get it right. When court reconvened at 9, Evelyn took her seat without ceremony. Her expression gave nothing away, but her eyes were sharper today, more focused. She'd reviewed every transcript, every timestamp, every line of testimony from the day before. Now she was ready to go deeper. The first order of business was the officer's official incident report, the one they'd filed after the stop. On the surface, it read like any other. Vehicle description, time, reason for stop, outcome. But Evelyn had marked it up with yellow sticky notes, each one pointing to a gap, a stretch, a flat-out contradiction. She turned to the older officer. In your report, you state that you asked the driver for identification immediately upon approach. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, he said, voice tighter than yesterday. Yet the body cam footage shows you speaking to her for nearly 40 seconds before requesting any documents. During that time, you asked where she was coming from, whether she lived in the area, and whether the car belonged to her. You did not ask for her license or registration until after she volunteered her address. Why the discrepancy? He shifted in his seat. I might have misremembered the sequence. Misremembered, she repeated, not as a question but as an observation. And in the same report you described the driver as visibly agitated and reluctant to cooperate. But the footage shows her speaking calmly, answering every question and even offering to retrieve her registration before you asked. Can you explain that? He glanced at his attorney, who gave a small, helpless shrug. I guess, under the circumstances, I interpreted her calmness as suspicious. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. Evelyn didn't react. She just turned a page in her notes. Suspicious, she said slowly. Because she wasn't angry? Because she didn't panic? Because she behaved like someone who understood her rights? He didn't answer. Then she called the department's records officer to the stand, a soft-spoken woman who handled digital logs. Evelyn asked her a simple question. When was the driver's license run through the system that night? The woman checked her screen. At 9:47 p.m. And what time did the stop begin? Approximately 9:32 p.m. So 15 minutes passed before you verified her identity? Yes. During those 15 minutes, the officers detained her, asked her to exit the vehicle, and conducted a pat-down before confirming she was who she said she was. Is that standard procedure? The records officer hesitated. No. Standard protocol requires identity verification as soon as possible, especially if there's no immediate threat. Evelyn nodded. Thank you. That one exchange did more damage than an hour of argument could. It wasn't about malice, at least not on the surface. It was about assumption, about treating a black woman's presence as inherently questionable, even when she posed no threat, even when she cooperated fully. And that, Evelyn knew, was the heart of the problem. Not one bad officer, but a system that allowed bias to masquerade as caution. Next came the internal affairs investigator, the one who'd initially reviewed Evelyn's complaint. He was a veteran, gray at the temples with tired eyes that had seen too many of these cases go nowhere. Evelyn asked him why her complaint had been downgraded to a misunderstanding in the first review. He sighed. There was no physical harm, no arrest. The officers claimed it was a routine stop. Without stronger evidence, we classified it as a communication issue. But you had the body cam footage, she said. We did. And you heard the comment made during the stop? He looked down. Yes. Yet you still closed the file. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, sometimes, we assume judges won't pursue it. That they'll let it go for the sake of professionalism. A ripple went through the room. Evelyn didn't flinch. Professionalism, she said, doesn't mean silence. It means integrity. She let that hang in the air for a long moment before moving on. Then came the most unexpected witness of the day, a dispatcher from the night shift. She hadn't been subpoenaed, she'd volunteered. She sat in the witness chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, voice barely above a whisper at first. I took the call that night, she said. It was from a neighbor who said a car had driven past their house twice. That was it. No description of the driver. No mention of suspicious behavior, just a car circling the block. Did you log that as a high-priority call? Evelyn asked. No, it was coded as low concern, routine patrol follow-up. Yet the officers treated it as justification for a full detention. The dispatcher nodded. They escalated it on their own. After she stepped down, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Evelyn turned to the officers again. You were responding to a vague, low-priority call. You detained a woman who gave you no reason to suspect her of wrongdoing. You failed to verify her identity promptly. You made assumptions based on her appearance. And you documented the encounter in a way that contradicted the evidence. Do you still believe you acted appropriately? The younger officer looked at the floor. The older one opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he had no defense. During the lunch break, the younger officer disappeared into the men's restroom and didn't come out for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, his eyes were red-rimmed. He didn't speak to his partner. He just sat in the back of the courtroom, arms crossed, staring at the floor like it might swallow him whole. Meanwhile, Evelyn ate a sandwich at her desk, turkey on whole wheat, the kind her husband used to make for her on court days. She thought about how he'd always said, "The truth doesn't need shouting. It just needs space to be heard." She was giving it that space now, one question at a time. When court resumed, Evelyn did something unusual. She called no more witnesses. Instead, she opened the floor for final statements, but not in the usual way. She turned to the officers directly. "If you could go back to that night," she said, "knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?" The younger officer looked up, startled. He swallowed hard. I'd run her license right away. I'd listen when she said she lived nearby. And I wouldn't let my assumptions take over." The older officer stayed silent for a long time. Then gruffly, "I'd treat her like I'd want my sister to be treated." It wasn't an apology. Not really, but it was a crack in the armor. And sometimes that's where the light gets in. Evelyn nodded. "Thank you." She then addressed the department's attorney. "Your client claims this was a mistake, not misconduct. But mistakes are corrected. Misconduct is concealed. Which was this?" He had no answer. As the day wound down, Evelyn summarized the facts, not with anger but with clarity. She laid out the timeline, the contradictions, the failures in protocol, the unspoken bias that colored every decision made that night. She didn't accuse. She simply showed. And in doing so, she made it impossible to look away. When she adjourned court, she didn't announce her decision. She said only, "I will issue my ruling tomorrow morning." People filed out slowly, quietly. The two officers lingered near the door, unsure whether to leave or wait. Evelyn packed her notes, slipped on her coat, and walked past them without a word. But as she passed the younger one, she paused just for a second and met his eyes. There was no judgment in her gaze, only sadness. And something else, hope. Not for them necessarily, but for what could come after this, for the chance to do better. Outside, the rain had stopped. Puddles reflected the gray sky like broken mirrors. Evelyn walked to her car, alone as always, but not lonely, because she knew deep in her bones that truth once spoken can't be unheard, and justice once seen can't be ignored. Tomorrow she would deliver her ruling, but tonight she would rest. Not because it was over, but because she'd done her part to make sure it mattered. The morning sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long golden streaks across the courthouse steps. Inside courtroom 4B, every seat was filled. Word had spread, not through headlines, but through hushed conversations in hallways, coffee shops, and squad cars. People came not for spectacle, but for something quieter, something rarer, the chance to see accountability in action. Reporters sat near the back, pens ready but faces unusually still. A few community members, mostly older women, some retired teachers, a couple of local pastors, sat in the front rows, hands folded, eyes steady. Even a handful of uniformed officers showed up, not in support of their colleagues, but in silent witness. They wanted to see what would happen when the system was asked to look in the mirror. Evelyn entered at exactly 9. She wore the same robe as before, but there was a new weight in her step. Not heavier, just clearer, as if she'd settled something inside herself overnight. She didn't glance at the gallery. She didn't look at the officers. She went straight to the bench, placed her notes down, and sat. The room fell silent before the bailiff even called it to order. She took a slow breath. Then she began. "I've reviewed the evidence," she said, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "I've listened to testimony. I've watched the footage. I've read the reports, and I've asked myself one question over and over. What does justice look like here?" She paused. Not for effect, but because the answer mattered too much to rush. "Justice isn't about punishment for the sake of pain," she continued. "It's not about humiliation or revenge. Justice is about truth. It's about making sure that what happened on that roadside doesn't happen again. To me, or to anyone else who looks like me or lives like me, or simply dares to exist in a space where they're told they don't belong." She looked down at her notes, then back up, her gaze steady. "The facts are not in dispute." 2 officers responded to a vague, low-priority call. They stopped a woman who was driving legally, calmly, and without suspicion. They failed to verify her identity in a timely manner. They detained her without cause. They subjected her to a pat-down based not on evidence but on assumption. and they documented the encounter in a way that contradicted both the video and their own actions. She turned slightly toward the officers. You were trained to protect and serve. But that night you protected your own bias and served your own fear. The older officer looked down. The younger one kept his eyes on her as if trying to memorize every word. Now, she said, I could suspend you indefinitely. I could recommend criminal charges. I could demand your badges be stripped today. And part of me, the part that stood on that road, hands raised, heart pounding, wants to. She let that hang in the air for a moment. Then her voice softened just slightly. But that wouldn't fix what's broken. It wouldn't teach you to see people instead of profiles. It wouldn't change the next stop, the next woman, the next moment when an officer has to choose between protocol and prejudice. She leaned forward slightly, hands resting on the bench, so here is my ruling. She spoke clearly, deliberately, each word measured. Both officers are suspended without pay for 30 days. During that time, you will complete a state-certified anti-bias training program. Not the online module you can click through in an hour, but the full 40-hour immersive course that includes community engagement, historical context, and real conversations with people you've been taught to fear. A murmur ran through the room. It wasn't lenient, but it wasn't final either. It was a bridge. Upon your return, she continued, you will be reassigned, not to patrol, but to the department's community liaison unit. For 6 months, you will attend neighborhood meetings, school events, senior centers. You will listen more than you speak. You will learn the names of the people in the neighborhoods you once policed like occupied territory. She paused again, letting that sink in. Additionally, your department will revise its stop and identify protocol within 60 days. No officer may detain a driver for more than 5 minutes without either verifying identity or establishing reasonable suspicion of a crime. Body cam footage must be reviewed by a civilian oversight panel in all cases involving complaints of racial profiling, and every officer will undergo annual implicit bias retraining, not as a checkbox but as a commitment. She looked at the department's attorney. You will report compliance to this court in writing. Then finally she turned back to the 2 officers. This isn't about shame, she said. It's about change. You made a choice that night. Today I'm giving you a chance to make a different one. The courtroom was utterly still. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Then quietly one of the older women in the front row wiped her eyes. No one spoke. No one applauded. But something had shifted, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for years. The officers stood when dismissed. The younger one nodded once quickly before turning away. The older one hesitated, then looked at Evelyn. Not with defiance, but with something closer to confusion, like he was trying to understand how someone he'd treated as a suspect could show him more mercy than he'd shown her. As they left, Evelyn remained seated for a long moment. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh in relief. She just sat, hands folded, eyes distant, because she knew the real work wasn't done. A ruling on paper wouldn't erase decades of mistrust, but it could be a start. Later that afternoon, after the reporters had filed their stories and the courthouse emptied, Evelyn walked down to the community center a few blocks away. She hadn't planned to go, but something pulled her there. Inside, a group of teenagers was gathered for a youth justice workshop, mostly black and brown kids, some in hoodies, some with notebooks, all listening intently to a former public defender. Evelyn lingered in the doorway unnoticed. One boy raised his hand. Do you think things can really change? He asked. The speaker didn't give a pep talk. Change doesn't come from waiting, he said. It comes from showing up and staying. Evelyn smiled faintly. Then she turned and walked back toward her car. On the drive home, she passed the intersection near Oak Hollow Park. She didn't slow down, but she glanced at the spot where she'd stood that night. It looked ordinary now, just asphalt, streetlights, trees swaying in the breeze. But she knew better. Places hold memory, and sometimes they hold promise too. That evening she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the same kind her husband used to brew. The sky turned pink, then purple, then deep blue. She thought about the younger officer's red-rimmed eyes, the older one's gruff admission, the way the courtroom had held its breath. She thought about the boy at the community center, asking if change was possible. She didn't have all the answers. But she knew this. Justice isn't a single act. It's a practice. A daily choice to see people fully, to question your own assumptions, to use whatever power you have, not to dominate, but to lift. Inside the house, the phone rang. It was the sergeant who'd shown up that night. "I just wanted to say, thank you," he said, "for not making it about vengeance, for making it about healing." She didn't say much in reply, just we all have work to do. After she hung up, she went to the kitchen and washed her teacup. Then she walked into the study, where her husband's old law books still lined the shelves. She ran her fingers over the spines, remembering how he'd always said, "The law is only as good as the people who carry it." Now she carried it, not with anger, but with care. Not with pride, but with purpose, and that she knew was enough. Weeks passed, and the story didn't explode like a headline. It seeped. Not in viral clips or outraged hashtags, but in quiet conversations at kitchen tables, in precinct roll calls, in community meetings where people finally felt safe enough to speak up. The ruling from Courtroom 4B became less of a scandal and more of a reference point. A moment people pointed to when they said, "It doesn't have to be this way." The department actually followed through. Within 60 days, the new Stop and Identify protocol was posted on every cruiser's dashboard. Body cam footage from profiling complaints now went to a civilian review panel made up of teachers, small business owners, and retired social workers, not just former cops. And the anti-bias training? It wasn't some perfunctory online quiz. Officers sat in circles with residents they'd once eyed with suspicion, listening to stories about being followed in stores, pulled over for driving while black, or told to calm down when asking for basic respect. Some walked out frustrated. Others stayed late, asking questions no one had ever let them ask before. As for the two officers, well, they disappeared from patrol. The younger one showed up at a neighborhood cleanup day in the very district where the stop had happened. He didn't wear his uniform. Just jeans and a plain t-shirt, gloves on his hands, picking up trash alongside teenagers who eyed him warily at first. But he kept coming back. Week after week. He started showing up at PTA meetings not to speak but to listen. One evening, an elderly woman, the same one who'd testified, nodded at him as he held the door open at the community center. He didn't say anything, just nodded back. That small exchange meant more than any apology ever could. The older officer never returned to street duty. He resigned 2 months after the ruling. No press release, no farewell party. Just a quiet letter to the chief citing personal reasons. Some said he couldn't face the change. Others said he finally saw himself clearly and didn't like what he found. Either way, he was gone. Evelyn kept doing her job. She presided over custody disputes, contract breaches, petty thefts, ordinary cases that made up the rhythm of the courthouse. But something had shifted in how people saw her. Not as distant or untouchable, but as someone who'd stood in the same storm they had and refused to let it break her. One rainy Tuesday, as she walked from the parking garage to the courthouse, a young woman approached her near the side entrance. She looked to be in her early 20s, dressed in a slightly too big blazer and clutching a notebook like a lifeline. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something close to awe. "Judge Carter?" she asked, voice soft but steady. Evelyn stopped. "Yes," the young woman took a breath. "I'm in law school. Second year. I watched the transcripts of your hearing. All of them." She paused, then added, "You showed us what courage looks like in a robe." Evelyn didn't smile right away. She studied the young woman. The set of her shoulders, the hope in her eyes, the way she held herself like she was still learning how to take up space. "No," Evelyn said gently. "I just showed up as myself." The young woman blinked as if that simple answer unraveled something inside her. "People think justice has to be loud," Evelyn went on. "But sometimes it's just showing up, calm, clear, and unwilling to disappear." The young woman nodded slowly. Then with a small, determined smile, she said, "I want to be like that." "You already are," Evelyn replied. "You're here, aren't you?" They stood there for a moment in the drizzle. 2 generations of black women linked not by blood, but by the quiet understanding that dignity isn't given. It's claimed. Every single day. Later that week, Evelyn received a letter. Not from the department, not from the media, but from a high school civics teacher in a neighboring town. She'd shown the edited, policy-compliant version of the hearing to her students, not as a lesson in law, but in humanity. One student had written in his reflection, "I used to think judges were just people in robes who said order in the court. Now I know there are people who decide what kind of world we live in. Evelyn pinned that quote to her office bulletin board, right next to the photo of her and her husband on the beach. At home, the silence still lingered. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like space to breathe, to remember, to rebuild. She started cooking again, something she hadn't done since her husband passed. Simple things, stew on Sundays, cornbread on Fridays. Sometimes she'd leave a plate on the porch for the neighbor's cat, just because it reminded her of how her husband used to do the same. One evening, as she watered the potted geraniums on her front steps, a patrol car slowed as it passed. Not the kind of slow that meant trouble, just a gentle pause. The officer inside gave a small wave. Evelyn waved back. No words, no tension. Just two people acknowledging each other in the fading light. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was different. Months later, the Community Liaison Unit hosted its first Coffee with Cops event, not in a police station but in the public library. Evelyn didn't attend, but she heard about it. The younger officer was there, sitting at a table with a group of teens, actually laughing at something one of them said. A local reporter captured the moment in a photo that ran in the paper the next day, not as a story of redemption, but as a glimpse of something new being built, brick by quiet brick. Back at the courthouse, Evelyn continued to wear her robe like armor, but also like a promise. She knew the system wasn't fixed, knew there would be other nights, other roadsides, other women standing with their hands visible, hoping to be seen as human. But now there was also a precedent, a paper trail, a memory that couldn't be erased. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. One spring afternoon, as cherry blossoms drifted down the courthouse lawn, Evelyn walked out after a long day. The air smelled like rain and fresh earth. She paused on the steps, watching a little girl chase petals with her grandmother. The child laughed, twirled, caught one in her palm, and held it up like treasure. Evelyn smiled. She thought of all the times she'd been made to feel small, not just that night on Maple Ridge Lane, but throughout her life. In classrooms, courtrooms, grocery store lines, she thought of how she'd learned to carry herself with quiet strength, not because she wanted to be strong, but because she had no other choice. But this little girl, maybe she wouldn't have to learn that lesson the same way. Maybe she'd grow up knowing her voice matters, her presence belongs, her dignity is non-negotiable. That was the real victory. Not the ruling, not the headlines, not even the changed policies. It was the possibility that the next generation might walk through the world a little lighter, a little freer because someone before them refused to be erased. Evelyn got into her car, the same modest sedan with the slightly worn tires. She drove home slowly, windows down, letting the spring air fill the cabin. She didn't need a monument. She didn't need applause. She just needed to keep showing up as herself. As a judge, as a woman who knew that justice isn't always loud, but it's always worth fighting for. One quiet act at a time. And in that ordinary drive home, under a sky streaked with sunset, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not because the battle was over, but because she knew she hadn't fought it alone, and that the echoes of that night on the roadside would ripple far beyond her, long after she was gone.